Well, hello and welcome to the second panel in the webinar series, Climate Accountability, Exploring the Options. And part two today is on the topic, Connecting the Dots, Attribution and Quantification of Climate Harms. My name's Stephen Wood, and I am the director of the Center for Law and Environment at the Allard School of Law at University of British Columbia. We're proud to provide a webinar platform for this series, which is brought to you jointly by West Coast Environmental Law, Allard School of Law, the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, and the Faculty of Law at Thompson Rivers University. And I will just mention that, as I said, this is the second in a series of webinars. A quick look at what's coming up. Next week at this time, on Monday, the 16th of November, the third panel in the series will be held, and that's called Sharing the Burden, Determination of Fossil Fuel Companies' Fair Shares. I will be moderating that webinar. And then the final webinar on Monday, November 23rd, also at 12 noon Pacific time. It's the final webinar, Putting It Together, Implications for Investors, Lenders, Insurers, Markets, Campaigners, and more. That final webinar will be moderated by Andrew Gage of West Coast Environmental Law. As I said, the overall title is Climate Accountability Litigation by Governments Against Fossil Fuel Companies, Exploring the Options. And without any further delay, I am going to hand over to the moderator of today's panel, Laura Spitz from Thompson Rivers University. So please take it away, Laura.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. Can people hear me fine? My microphone is working. Okay, terrific. So I'm just, of course, I'm Laura Spitz, and I teach at Thompson Rivers University. I also teach at the University of New Mexico, where I'm on leave. I want to begin by first acknowledging with gratitude and respect that the Thompson Rivers University campus that I work from is located at Kamloops to Secwepemc within the unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. And for those folks who are interested in climate change, which I'm assuming is all of you on the webinar, you'll know that the Secwepemc people are especially implicated in the Trans Mountain pipeline and currently engaged in a conversation with governments at all levels here where I sit. Second, I want to thank, like Chris last week, I want to thank Andrew Gage especially from West Coast Environmental Law, because he conceived of this webinar series really, and he did most of the work, and then we get to look pretty good in the universities having these conversations with super smart people that Andrew mostly tracked down. So thank you so much, Andrew. And then especially also to Stefan and Veronica at Allard, because they have really, behind the scenes, made the actual webinars themselves possible. So super grateful. And then just lastly, I want to say I'm also grateful to my colleagues, Karis Campus and Nicole Shabus, who I believe are on the webinar, but have their videos off. All right, and then as Stefan said, this is the second in a series of 4, and they were all intended that you could simply watch one, but just to locate this one, we really started last week with the challenges and opportunities and the theories upon which these cases are brought. And today we're going to focus on attribution and quantification. So thinking about how do you measure who did what, those kinds of questions, and then move from quantification to contribution next week. So when we think about contributory negligence, for example, just as one example. We're thinking about contribution next week. So who's going to pay what in what fair share and so on. And then as Stephan said, we move from there to implications to the broader community. So that's how that's going. All right. Today we have three super amazing speakers. We have Sophie Marjanik, who will speak to us first from Australia. Are you in Australia right now? Yes, no, I think.
I'm actually in London. I'm actually in London.
You're in London today, okay. And she's going to be followed by Dr. Rachel Licker and then Dr. Nathan Badabankur. And I'm going to introduce each of them as they speak rather than at the beginning. And I just want to finish before I introduce Sophie by saying that we're super excited about engagement with the people who are watching and really want to have question and answer both with each speaker as they're going, like when Sophie's finished. If there's questions just for her, then we'll talk about those then, and then otherwise we'll wait. We're hoping to have an hour at the end, or at least some period of time that we can have a meaningful conversation. And if folks could do that, please, in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're monitoring the question and answer rather than in the chat. So if you could use the question and answer function rather than the chat function. All right, so we'll get started because you're not here to see me. Sophie Marjanik is an Australian lawyer currently located in London with degrees in both law and international studies. She's currently the lead climate accountability lawyer at Client Earth, where she specializes in climate change law, climate litigation, and environmental human rights. So for example, at Climate Earth, her team has brought claims against governments and companies, so both public and private sector, to force emission reductions. Prior to joining Client Earth, Sophie was a senior lawyer at Clayton Utz, specializing in environmental law. And before that, and I'm super interested in this, although it's not for us to talk about today, she worked in the remote Torres Strait region of what we of course now call Australia, where she undertook litigation, negotiation, and advocacy on behalf of Indigenous landowners. So welcome, Sophie. I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Laura. And before we begin, I am in London today, but given that this webinar is virtually happening in BC, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners and Indigenous inhabitants of British Columbia, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'll now share my screen. Oop. Give me 1 second. As Laura very kindly introduced me, I'm an Australian qualified environmental lawyer. I have been practicing with Client Earth here in London for the past 5 years. My background was environmental and planning law. I used to have a lot of developer and estate clients, and now happily the Earth is my client. And Client Earth works in the public interest. We're a philanthropically funded charity based in Europe with offices throughout Europe, but also in Beijing, and a growing presence in Asia, and really working globally. Our lawyers come from all around the world, so we have a really global view. Today, I am going to discuss some of the legal issues that arise, particularly in climate change litigation against corporate entities. And I've called this the title of the presentation, Making Out the Steps in the Causal Chain. And I think one of the key elements that I just wanted to discuss with you is thinking about breaking down some of those evidentiary steps that one needs to prove to link a particular fossil fuel company, usually known as the carbon majors, oil and gas sector entities, with specific damages in a region or a country, a state around the world arising from climate change, climate change related environmental degradation. Planet Earth uses the law to fight climate change, empower people and promote the rule of law, protect the natural world. I think I've said enough about us. If you want to know more about Planet Earth, please do go to our website. So today I'll just start with a brief introduction to climate change litigation, step through some of the key legal principles required to establish liability, discuss the concept of attribution science, and there are a few different types of attribution science, so we do need to be careful when using the terminology attribution to be specific about what kind of attribution science and what kind of science we're actually really talking about there. Take you through some case studies, and then I might leave the discussion to the end, given that we'll have that hour. So we will very happy to take questions in the discussion. So what is climate change litigation? There are a number of academic definitions, but essentially climate change litigation are those cases, from my point of view, from Planet Earth's point of view, those cases that seek to drive states and governments or companies to take greater action to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The particular kind of litigation that we're seeing around the world at the moment, many academics are calling this the so-called second wave of climate change litigation. There was a wave probably around 2006 or so with the Massachusetts and EPA, very famous US Supreme Court case, and famous case against ExxonMobil in tort called Kivalina. That's generally referred to as the first wave, and I think it's probably said that we are now in the second wave of climate change litigation. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases around the world at the moment that are seeking, brought in, not always in the public interest, some brought by industry groups to defend rules relating to emissions that perhaps benefit them. But there are more and more and more cases brought by NGOs, charities, grassroots organizations, individuals, to working together with creative lawyers to address the real intransient political problem of climate change, where we've seen a lack of political action for the past 30 years since the agreement of the UNFCCC. People around the world are really turning to the law to try and solve these issues. So in terms of fossil fuel entities, that is companies, who can these claims be filed against? Obviously, the physical scientific process of climate change happens at a global level. However, it is also deeply local. So the multi-scalar dimensions of climate change make it one of the most challenging problems for the law to deal with, which the law frankly doesn't deal particularly well with complex problems happening at multiple levels of action. So at the global level, we have international law. We've got the UNFCCC framework there. That's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there at the top really sits the Paris Agreement and the international agreement to reduce or for all states to implement their highest possible ambition to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5. So that's the international framework. However, working down from there, we have national governments, states, with their nationally determined contributions made under the Paris Agreement. Some states have implemented those commitments, international political commitments, into domestic law, such as the UK has a Climate Change Act. However, some states have not, and some states have taken very little action since the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015. Then, of course, under that, we have various sectors within which emissions are produced, obviously transport, industry, energy, aviation, homes, agriculture. So there are a variety of, and there are a variety, even within just the energy system, there are a variety of producers selling fossil fuels to many different businesses. And the way that these emissions are regulated, which is mainly at the point that the fuel is combusted, also varies. So highly regulated for high intensity sectors, such as the energy sector, but not regulated at all, where individuals are permitted to use as much petrol, fuel, gas, as you call it, in their vehicles as possible. So furthermore, there are jurisdictional issues. Fossil fuels may be produced by a company that's incorporated in one country, extracted in another country, then sold for use in another country. And all the oil majors operate as globally interconnected multinationals, which makes questions of jurisdiction incredibly difficult. Different governments have responsibilities for regulating production and combustion. And it's also generally quite difficult for individuals to successfully sue companies if they have no legal presence in the country in which they live. And you know, the example of the Alien Tort Statute in the US demonstrates that, you know, that those rights for persons affected in the so-called global south really are being reduced for the benefit of globally north incorporated corporate entities. So this just throws up the question, who is responsible for climate change? Is it governments, fossil fuel users, producers? And many of these have been the subject of litigation to varying levels of success. So there are a number of potential claims, ways in which claims can be brought. This diagram attempts to summarize some of those. Clone Earth, we have done work around all of these. So we've got climate change impacted communities, you might call them victims in a human rights context. There could be claims in tort or statutory liability against fossil fuel producers. There may be claims from shareholders against fossil fuel producers. In terms of users, there might be claims in tort and product liability as well against those producers. So there are really many different legal theories that one can use, and I'll give some examples after I discuss some of the science. So boiling down some of the key legal issues, because it's not possible to go through each of the causes of action with you today, but there are a few key points that I think might help frame the thinking about this and these considerations. So firstly, establishing a duty of care. That's critical in tort. It's critical in a human rights claim as well. And what really is important here, I think, for science and for scientists and for anyone trying to build these kind of cases is, was that harm foreseeable? It's a critical step in establishing a duty of care or a human rights obligation or liability. And that's where I think scientists, and particularly climate scientists, can really play an important role in litigation by identifying what kinds of extreme weather events, what kinds of physical impacts from climate change are going to occur, become more likely, frequent, or intense in a particular region, so that lawyers can define foreseeability and argue that it's reasonable in whatever legal context to impose a duty of care. Secondly, the perennial problem in climate change litigation is causation, which is the concept that of the but-for test, sine qua non causation, which simply means that but for the defendant's actions, the claimant's harm would not have been suffered. But for causation is the standard legal test. However, it is fundamentally incompatible and inappropriate in the context of climate change, which is a global problem in which many different actors contribute to. That's common to many other environmental regulatory issues as well. It's something that I think it's something that is always seen as a huge hurdle in climate change litigation, potentially to our detriment. I think that you know, there have been many cases around about pollution and also involving medical negligence, and in other contexts where multiple causal agents have been identified and the court separates out on a pro rata or other basis on the basis of multiple tortfeasors. So I think causation is seen as a really difficult hurdle, but we also don't want to over-egg that one, to be honest. And then loss and damage. Can the claimant show that loss and damage has already occurred or will imminently occur? And I think that's what Nathan will speak about a bit more in his talk, how to build the evidence for loss and damage to the individuals who have actually, who are actually bringing the claim. In terms of science, the term attribution science is used very frequently in this field. But I do recommend that you all check out the Sabin Center and the work of Michael Berger, where he's really broken down attribution science into 4 main categories. Firstly, there is just general climate attribution, which is obviously what's in the IPCC. That's attributing the increase in global mean surface temperatures to various atmospheric forcings. The clear finding of the IPCC is that human anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are the dominant cause of that warming. That's known as attribution and detection science. We've then got probabilistic event attribution, which probabilistic event attribution, which is very sort of exciting and new and dynamic branch of science. A lot of really great work coming out of Oxford University at the moment. We're lucky enough to have really good connections with the researchers there. And that science attempts to disentangle the causes of a specific extreme weather event, such as a heat wave, a hurricane, a drought, perhaps, or a wildfire, and to quantify the extent to which anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have made that event stronger, so more intense and therefore damaging, or more frequent, so more likely to occur. There are many challenges in these studies, many of which revolve around the framing of the study, how well the scientists understand that weather process as it is, and the fact that fundamentally extreme weather events are difficult to study and understand because they are very rare by definition. And therefore one is always, and it's very, very difficult to identify the counterfactual, one is always sort of operating within a realm of some kind of false sense of comparison. So it's a very interesting field. Again, I pulled out these 3 key issues: causation, foreseeability, and loss and damage. So the third area of attribution science is not just linking that extreme weather event such as the drought or the heat wave. I think heat waves are the best example. But actually saying, well, in that heat wave, how many people passed away or were injured due to that event, compared to perhaps other factors, other contributing health factors. And that's another step in the causal chain that is, again, a new branch of science. And there are very few of those studies. I think probably that's an area where we'd really like to see a little bit more work. The classic first probabilistic event attribution study was done on the Paris heatwave of 2003. There was an impact study done after that by David Mitchell and some colleagues, but that relied on epidemiological evidence. I think there's definitely much more to be done on linking impacts to individuals from those events, and then attempting to quantify that, attempting to quantify the impact of climate change. So the fourth and final sort of use of the term attribution is attribution of greenhouse gas emissions to the carbon majors. The carbon majors are the largest producers, that is extractors, of fossil fuels in our planet's history. Many of them are private entities that are the descendants, I suppose, of companies that operated throughout the 20th century. But some of the entities in this list, some of the companies in this list, such as British Coal, don't exist anymore. They have been deregistered and they simply are no longer around, although many of them are. Many of them are state-owned entities. And the big report in this area is a study done by Richard Heady. I mean, this took him, a decade. It's really his life's work. He spent 10 years digging through the production reports of these companies. He went through archives and he quantified how many tons or what volume of fossil fuels each entity had extracted, times that by a combustion factor, and came up with a percentage that each of these companies contributed to the current climate crisis. So this study has been relied on in many, a lot of litigation that's going on today. I'll just whiz through these slides, assume that you all have probably quite a good understanding of the impacts of climate change, the physical impacts, but they obviously include these impacts here: extreme weather events, drought, flooding, sea level rise, etc. I was just going to discuss the difference between perhaps relying on the more general IPCC science and impacts at a global level versus impacts at a regional and local level, because I think it's much easier to prove in litigation those global impacts, but actually much harder to specify down to the local level. And that's something that hopefully Nathan and his team will be working on. Sea level rise is an impact that we're relying on in a human rights case that I'm acting in for people in Australia. And I think that this is actually a really interesting impact where, although where you can rely on the global science at the local level. So sea level rise is actually a very, I think, convincing impact. It's a much less controversial than where we're trying to disentangle the causes and drivers of extreme weather events, particularly those more difficult weather events like hurricanes. This is a diagram showing how a probabilistic event weather event attribution works. I might leave that to Rachel because I think she will discuss that further in her talk. So I will move on to a couple of case studies really quickly in my final 5 minutes. There are a plethora of tort claims being brought in the United States at the moment against the carbon majors as defined in the Richard Heady report. I thought I'd mention the City of Oakland case because there was a really interesting hearing in that case a couple of years ago that related to climate science. At the moment, there are upwards of 15 cases in the US. They're being brought by states, cities, local authorities, the City of New York, and obviously the City of Oakland. The complainant claims that the defendants are liable for causing or contributing to a public nuisance under Californian law, and they seek contribution to the city's adaptation costs. The reason why I thought I'd mention this one was, as I said, the climate science session that was held by Justice Alsop, and in this case, Judge Alsop organised a 5-hour tutorial for the plaintiffs and the defendants to present on climate science relevant to the case. And it was really interesting to see there one of the lead authors of the IPCC, Miles Allen, together with Exxon's chief counsel, and they weren't actually arguing over the science of global climate change. And I think it's instructive that, you know, Exxon clearly wouldn't seriously argue on that point in court. What they disputed, however, was the date on which their company became aware of the risks of climate change and how early, in fact, they knew that climate change was a global problem that was likely to cause harm around the world. So in that original claim, Justice Alsop unfortunately did not find that the claim was admissible, and Shearedling appealed, and the claimants appealed that decision. But in that decision, Justice also spent more than 4 pages outlining the history of climate science, and he actually said climate scientists are in vast consensus that the combustion of fossil fuels has, in and of itself, material increased carbon dioxide levels, which has in turn increased the medium temperature of the planet, and noted the vast consensus on this. However, he said the problem here is not the science, it is the law. And I think that is a really interesting comment that shows that, in fact, the law is not keeping pace with the complexity of these global environmental challenges that we're facing today. Another claim, a European tort claim. This one is being brought by a farmer who lives in Peru. He lives in a remote area underneath or within the flood path of a glacier, a glacial lake that is melting due to increasing temperatures in the Andes. He has filed a claim in a German court assisted by a German lawyer under the German Civil Code, arguing that the largest German emitter, RWE, which is the national energy company, contributed to climate change knowingly, 0.47%, in fact, of global emissions, and is requesting 0.47% of the costs of mitigating his risk. Now, they have actually valued his risk as being relatively low. Mr. Illua is actually only claiming about 18,000 euros. So the volume of damages being claimed in that case is really very low. So that's a different, perhaps, strategy to those cases of the big US cities and states where they're actually claiming millions in damages from the carbon majors. Another case that I thought I would mention, just because this shows the scope and variety of climate change litigation, is this claim being brought by the Conservation Law Foundation against Shell. And this is more, rather than a tort claim for historic emissions, this is really about companies failing to put in place proper adaptation measures to protect their assets from climate change now. CLF is claiming that Shell hasn't complied with the Clean Water Act because their refinery facility in Rhode Island is at risk of flooding caused by sea level rise, more rain, more storms, storm surges, etc. And for me, this case really highlights the fact that climate litigation will pop up all over the place and in ways that we don't necessarily foresee, and potentially it could drive liability for all sorts of managers of property and infrastructure who aren't properly preparing for its impacts. So certainly something for local authorities, I think, to take into account as well, because it they may take claims against the carbon majors, but also they need to be asking themselves, have we properly prepared for climate change with our local infrastructure? Are we making sure that we're protecting people who live in our area? Are we making sure that we are properly upgrading our flood defences, that we are properly improving our seawalls where there's a risk of storm surge to coastal properties? So local authorities, they may owe duties of care as well as pursuing damages against fossil fuel entities. very briefly, there's another claim against the carbon majors in the Philippines Commission on Human Rights. This is a huge inquiry that has been going on for several years. And it's asked the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines to investigate whether the carbon majors have responsibility for damage done to Filipino citizens victims of Typhoon Haiyan. The Commission's final report will be coming out in the next month. So we're all waiting for that one with bated breath. That's been a really long process, and I think there's been a huge amount of evidence presented to the Commission, and that report will be really interesting, and it will be fascinating to read. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to stop there. I hope I've left enough for the other presenters, Laura.
You're doing great. That was super, super interesting. I don't know if anybody wants, if now's a good time to break for questions, or whether or not maybe we should, since Rachel's is so connected to yours, maybe we move to Rachel's unless someone has a question. I'm going to remember that I wanted to ask you, Sophie, about in your drawing with respect to who could potentially bring claims against whom. I'm super interested about the claims you identified from shareholders to users. So I'm just going to I wrote down notes, so I won't interrupt with my question yet, but I will. I'm going to be wanting to ask you that when we get through Rachel. So let's move on. Thank you so much for that. That was super interesting. I'm excited to see the connections between that and the next two presentations. So Dr. Rachel Dicker is speaking next, and is she, yep, I see her. I don't see her video, but I see her that she's here. Hi, so she earned her PhD in environmental resources and her bachelor's degree in biology, both right from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she also holds a master's in science in environmental studies and sustainability from Lund University in Sweden. So today she is a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which I think is a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. Yep. And in her role, she communicates climate science to policymakers. So I'm super interested to hear you talk. Communicates climate science to policymakers, to the public, and to the media, which is a super important job. As lawyers know, we need to be able to know how to talk about what we're trying to prove. She analyzes new developments in climate science and works to defend climate science budgets and programs. So budgets, again, that was something that really stood out to me. Prior to joining the Union of Concerned Scientists, Rachel completed an American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which is a super prestigious fellowship, actually, for folks who don't know, serving as a foreign affairs officer with the US Department of State, where she worked with the Global Environmental Facility Trust Fund. So we're super lucky to have you, and I'm going to turn it over to you and connect with questions at the end.
Hi, thank you so much. And apologies, I have a very sad toddler upstairs that you may hear crying in a moment. I'm just going to go ahead and get my slides up and running and share my screen with you all. Just bear with me. And here we go. Okay. Just verifying it's all working. Excellent. So thank you so much. And yes, as Laura mentioned, some of what I'm going to be speaking about does overlap a bit with what Sophie mentioned. Hopefully they'll come across as complementary and, multiple sides of the coin. So I wanted to start off just kind of with, I always like to speak about, what we really are talking about when we're talking about attribution, and just get on the same page about the fact that, we attribute events and trends to specific causes all the time. the United States, at least, it's a very, very familiar idea to understand the role of subprime loans in the 2008 economic recession, the role of the pharmaceutical companies in the opioid crisis, and, even in ecology, the decline of bald eagles to, pesticide use like DDT. So this idea of attribution is really something that is quite familiar and a daily thing. And so in climate science, things have gotten increasingly granular. It started out with attributing really global changes to human activity. So what I'm showing you here on the left, this is a graph showing you global mean temperature change since pre-industrial times. This is in degrees Fahrenheit from our National Climate Assessment, since that's how things go in the US. And what you can see are, the different projections of temperature over this time period in different colors from different global climate models. In black, it's showing you the observation of global temperature change over this time period. And what the main message of this is really saying is that the observations are very close to what the models have been predicting. And basically the models do a really good job of simulating temperature change. On the right, what you can see is if you run those exact same models, but you only force the models with natural forcings like solar activity or volcanic activity, and you remove all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, you get the dark blue line that kind of hovers around not much change in temperature. And obviously that's very different from the observations of global temperature. And so basically this is telling us that it's not possible to have the world that we have, the climate that we have, if you do not account for human-caused greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And so now, as Sophie touched upon a bit, climate science has been able to get into the realm of being able to tell us about the role of emissions in specific extreme events. Now you might hear my dog. I don't know what you're able to hear in the background. It's just family circus amidst COVID. So, this is science that's really improving all the time. So, for example, this is a statement taken out of a paper on Hurricane Harvey that mentioned, was able to tease apart how much of the precipitation was intensified because of climate change, and also the likelihood that the event would have occurred. And so, being able to say that Hurricane Harvey was 3 times more likely because of human-caused climate change. We're really at the point where we can say those kinds of things in relatively real time, because, that was something that historically, the media really wanted to know when they were reporting on extreme events. How is this climate change? Are we seeing climate change? So, scientists made investments in being able to answer that question quickly so that the public could really understand the world around them better. And now climate science is shifting to be able to look at not just climate change resulting from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Science is able to also attribute specific changes to specific carbon sources. So this is the data set from Rakiti that Sophie mentioned earlier, and it's showing you in blue the global carbon emissions from all fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers since 1850 in millions of tons. And in red, it's showing you that same value, but just for those top 90 carbon producers, the carbon majors. Again, this is work Rakiti published in 2014, and this is since pre-industrial times to present. And he found that nearly 2/3 of all industrial carbon emissions starting from the Industrial Revolution onward can be traced to the products from those 90 carbon producers, both investor and state owned. And you can also see that the vast majority of those emissions have occurred since the mid-1900s, which is the time period in which the fossil fuel industry was well aware of the climate-related risks of their products. So now my colleague Brenda Acquarzola at the Union of Concerned Scientists worked with colleagues to run a simple climate model using the emissions data from Mercator and use that to calculate an global average surface temperature and sea level rise that's tied to the emissions from these 90 carbon producers. She published this work in 2017. There's link to the study there at the bottom here. And she found that emissions from the extraction and products of those 90 large carbon producers over 1880 to 2010 contributed about 42 to 50% of the global temperature rise that we've observed over that time period. And as I mentioned, they also looked at sea level rise as well, and found that between 26 to 32% of the global sea level rise that's occurred between 1880 to 2010 can be tied to these 90 large carbon majors products. We can also look at global ocean acidification because it has a very well-known relationship with atmospheric CO2. And so what I'm showing you here on the top, these are taken from a paper that was in the Royal Society and US National Academy of Sciences in 2014. And on the top, so what you're seeing is this famous increase of atmospheric CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in parts per million, and the kind of swiggle of the increase and decrease each year as the Earth kind of breathes in and breathes out, as we have more vegetation and less during the seasons. And then you can also see the concentration of carbon dioxide following that in the surface of the ocean. And on the bottom, it's showing you the pH of the surface of the ocean and how it's been declining as the concentration of CO2 increases in the atmosphere and in the surface of the ocean. So there's a very quick exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ocean that's leading to this direct relationship. So what we did then is we took the emissions from Mercator's data set, this time from the 88 largest carbon producers over a slightly different time period. We extended the work to 2015, and there were 88 large carbon producers considered because there were a couple of mergers and acquisitions, which led to a slightly smaller number. And we also looked at changes between 1965 to 2015, again, because that's the time period within which or by which I should say, the fossil fuel industry was aware of the climate-related risks of their products. So what we did was we examined the global ocean surface pH, which was attributable to the emissions traced to these 88 largest carbon producers. And we did so with an energy balance carbon cycle model approach. And what you can see is that when you look at the emissions since pre-industrial times to present approximately, the emissions tied to these large carbon producers caused about, more than half of the observed acidification of our ocean. And similarly, if you look at the emissions since 1965 to 2015 from these companies, it also caused more than half of the acidification of our ocean since pre-industrial times. Since, as I showed you previously, so much of the emissions from these corporations happened, or the emissions that can be tied to the products of these companies can be occurred since the mid 1900s. And you can find in the publication and the supplemental information all of the results tied to specific companies. What I'm showing you here are the top 20 investor-owned and majority state-owned companies, and the ocean acidification that's tied to the products from these corporations. And what you can see here, again, there's specific numbers like Chevron, which is an investor-owned corporation. The emissions tied to the products of Chevron contributed about 2% of the acidification of the ocean since pre-industrial times. So, obviously the responsibility and the discussion in the legal community of majority state-owned or investor-owned corporation is a bit different, so we have it broken out as such here. In our study, we also looked at what, and I should say this is a study that was published, the ocean acidification portion, in Environmental Research Letters last year. We did this work, I did this with Brenda Eckwurzel and Peter Frumhoff, also at Union of Concerned Scientists, and also in collaboration with Scott Doney, who's at University of Virginia, Sarah Cooley at Ocean Conservancy, Yvonne Lima, who is at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and Rick Keaty as well. You know, we were also interested in understanding the risk from ocean acidification for areas that have had disproportionately large changes over these time periods. So what I'm showing you here is it highlighted in red the changes or the areas that we focused on, and the map, sorry, let me back up for a moment. So the map is showing you changes in ocean pH between 1960s to present. So the areas that are darker blue are changes that had more ocean acidification happen. And in red, we are demarcating the areas that we looked at in terms of the risks as a result of ocean acidification. And I should say two other things about this part of the study. First of all, we focused in on regions. Sorry, my daughter is very sad right now. We focused in on regions that, as a result of both expert judgment and looking at different relationships in the ocean model that we used, we are very confident that the largest driver of the ocean acidification was human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And also we did this analysis using a 3D ocean model. And so we were able to work at a pretty fine resolution, but not fine enough to capture all of the nuances of some of the dynamics around coastal regions like the Gulf of Maine. And so what we did was we adapted the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's risk assessment framework, to look at what is at risk of loss and damage as a result of ocean acidification for the different 5 marine regions. And let me just name them, go back for a moment. They were the Arctic, the Coral Triangle, which is kind of the islands around Indonesia, Philippines, South, and others around Southeast Asia, the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska, the Peru Current, and the California Current. And so, you know, the IPCC's risk assessment framework looks at what happens when you overlay a hazard like ocean acidification with vulnerabilities stemming from socioeconomic variables and factors and biological systems, as well as the exposure, like as a result from you know, a fishing community or another human community that's present and sort of being exposed to that hazard. And what we found was we looked at a number of indicators of socioeconomic vulnerability to consider what might be at risk of being lost as a result of ocean acidification in these marine regions. And so, for example, we looked at fisheries harvest as one indicator. And we found that in the US, for example, in the California Current, the states that are in that region reported fisheries landings of about 425,000 tons in 2016, which supported more than 40,000 jobs. And the California Current is also home to a robust aquaculture system that supports about 1,400 different jobs in the area. Within the Coral Triangle, the fisheries associated with that region's coral reefs are worth about $3 billion a year. In the Peru Current, the fisheries landings there yielded about 6.7 million tons and supported more than 1,500 156,000, pardon me, jobs. And so you know, what we're really trying to be able to say with this is, you know, we're confident that the vast majority of the ocean acidification in these regions is caused by human-caused climate change. We can tell you about the specific contribution of different corporations to the ocean acidification or at a global scale. And you know, these are regions that are at particular that are particularly being harmed, and these are the kinds of things that are at risk in these different regions of being harmed as a result of ocean acidification. But something that I just want to note is that, you know, economic praxes are do leave out some key impacts of ecosystems and human communities that are facing loss and damage from ocean acidification. So, for example, in the Arctic, you know, there currently isn't an economically valuable fishery system, but, you know, it's, as you can see in the map that I showed you previously, it is experiencing really considerable ocean acidification, particularly relative to the rest of the world. And so, you know, it might not have a big dollar number attached to it, but, you know, it does have marine ecosystems that are being severely affected and will continue to be as we pump more CO2 into the atmosphere. So we did include it because we think that, you know, it is an area where we might not be able to quantitatively describe the, you know, what's at risk in the same way as the other regions. It's maybe more of a qualitative description of the impacts on ecosystems, but we also see it as very important as well. So that, I'm just gonna thank you, and I look forward to questions. I'm just putting up my contact information here, and look forward to discussing further with you all. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was super interesting. There's just one question that I think maybe I'm going to ask you right now from the question and answer, because it's very specific to your presentation before we move on to Nathan, and then we can have a broader discussion. Somebody asks on your slide about the intensity likelihood of Hurricane Harvey. I don't know if you're able to go back to that. Yeah. She wanted to know what is meant by equivalently in that. Is the same exercise undertaken to determine the impact of climate change on both intensity and likelihood of extreme weather events?
Yeah, great question. Let me just go back. I'll put that up really quick. Or I will attempt to put it up really quickly. And okay, going back. Let's see. Okay, so the study here was saying that, yeah, the precipitation was made about 15% more intense, and or equivalently. I'm just trying to think of what, apologies, it is sort of in its extraction from the context from the study, a bit difficult. I think what they're doing here is they're making, you know, a probability assessment, and basically, yeah, I think equivalently is a little bit of a funny word there. I think my interpretation of this is really that these are, yeah, there are two different ways of interpreting the results of the study, basically, and that, that, you know, with being able to attribute the changes, both like the intensity of the storm, and its link to human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, they were also able to attribute, you know, the probability that the storm would or would not have occurred without kind of but for human-caused climate change. So in my mind, I can go back and I can look to see if that's actually an accurate characterization, but I've always interpreted this to mean that there are a couple of different sort of conclusions that you can, or ways of interpreting attribution that you can get from this study. So I hope that that's clears that answer a little bit.
It makes sense to me what you just said.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you're dealing with the same set of
Right.
factors or whatever the word is, and it could
Right.
either mean it's one way of measuring it is this way, and another way of measuring it is this
Right.
is this way. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Awesome. I have one more question for you very specifically, Rachel, and then I'm going to let it go so we can get on to Nathan. When contribution to climate change is assessed for the major producers, does this refer to the carbon produced in the extraction process or the consumption process?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming by consumption, that's our consumption of their
right.
fossil fuels. Yeah.
It's all of it. So it does include the extraction process, but it also includes the consumption of the products. And, obviously, can you then say, oh, the companies are 100% responsible, or they're responsible for some portion of that? That is the societal discussion that we're having. These are the kinds of, things that the courts are having to decide. But what we're trying to do is provide kind of the full picture of the story of what can be tied to the products from these different corporations, and then the societal discussion progresses from that point. But yes, it's both.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because probably in science that, and then to the lawyers in the room, I had the same question actually, whether it was extraction or consumption. So that's great. Okay. We'll move on, and then we'll have time for the larger discussion. So Dr. Nathan Vadabancourt is an environmental scientist and entrepreneur, and he's the founder of Smart Shores, which I spent some time reading about. Sounds like a super cool company. You seem to be based in Vancouver, so I'm assuming it's a British Columbia company, but maybe it's not. Maybe he's incorporated federally or something, that offers coastal climate change impact assessment, surveying, and automated landscape feature detection services using machine learning and artificial intelligence. Super cool. So it sounds like measuring what's going on is what he's doing with all of these cool technologies. He brings to this new project a super deep experience in several areas that are relevant to our conversation today. So just a few examples. He's led climate change assessment reports for the Canadian federal government, worked as a climate change impacts and adaptation advisor to clients in the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. He's led scholarly research projects, and he's taught courses in environmental science, I believe at the University of British Columbia. He has an undergraduate degree in science from the University of Illinois, and both a master's and a PhD in resource management and environmental studies from UBC, where he was a SHRC fellow. Without any more, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Nathan.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much, Laura, Stefan, Andrew, and the Allard Center for hosting this event. This is a great conversation to have. I'm glad to be a part of it. To everyone watching online, welcome to my living room. This is my nice COVID conference center with my little Christmas lights in the background there, just to create a bit of festivity in a tough time. So today I'm going to talk about the quantification of these climate impacts that we've been discussing so far today. There are big changes going on in the Earth's biogeochemical systems, as we've heard. There are pushes to hold the companies that have been responsible for this to account financially. And as we've also heard today, there is strong science behind the attribution of these impacts to particular actors. And so in setting out the case for what kind of damages people ought to pay, we need to try and quantify these and create a number to say, hey, these are the damages that have been incurred. And so I'm going to talk about that today. I'm going to get to some of the numbers and some of the way we got to the numbers. But I also want to talk about what we can't quantify and why. We've, at the beginning, talked about, at the beginning of this conversation, the traditional territories on which, of Indigenous people, from which people are presenting, and throughout British Columbia, throughout Canada, throughout the world. That is an issue that continues to come up in climate change impacts and adaptation. Through a lot of my work, I've been able to travel around the coast and around the country to traditional territories where climate impacts are not measured so much in quantitative and dollar terms, but rather in intangible cultural values. And I want to talk about that and why that's an important part of the discussion as well. And so to provide some context for this discussion, the quantitative numbers and these important intangible, more qualitative values we also have to talk about, I want to start by giving a very, very brief history of why we think about things in terms of numbers from our kind of Western scientific perspective, and then get into what these numbers are, and then at the end come back around to say, and here's what this approach to numbers misses, and what we might be able to start doing to move towards integrating these into our assessments of risk. So I'll share my screen. I'll get my slides up, and we should be ready to rock. So let's see, there we go. This is the presentation, Assessing the Costs of Climate Change. And this is a beautiful estuary on the west coast of Vancouver Island that has a lot of intangible biodiversity values. It has a lot of intangible First Nations cultural and use values, and it has, as you can see, some infrastructure running through it. All of these things are different ways of looking at value. Some of these things can be priced. The value can be represented in price. Some of them can't. So let's get into how we calculate these numbers and what it means. So first, how do you set a price for the world? When the field of ecosystem services came out in the late 1990s, it created this opportunity to look at the value that the environment provides to us for free through things like carbon sequestration, water filtration, flood prevention. And there are some studies that came up with these astronomical values for how much nature contributes to us as a kind of in-kind economic contribution. And then the critique that emerged from this was, well, this is all a gross underestimation of infinity, because if we don't have any of these things, there's no life. So this is the ecosystem service valuation field has evolved and adapted to focus in on a lot more specific things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, a very, very brief history of quantification. And this is probably the least sexy slide because it's just a bunch of letters. But hopefully we'll get through this quickly and have some context for why we think the way we do. Let's go back 2,800 years to the time of Homer in ancient Greece, when what happened when climates changed, when they were or rather when weather changed, when there were extreme events, when there were diseases, when things happened, this was a result of the capricious will of the gods, and people weren't really seen as being empowered actors to be able to do anything about it. As society and technology advanced, we got into the classical period, people started to understand that a more quantitative way of looking at the world and manipulating the environment can yield better agricultural returns and more increases in standard of living for people. And so we entered this period called the age of rational thought, where we had people like Pythagoras looking at math as a way of understanding God's language, where science was an idea of understanding God's mystery in the world. But as this advanced through Plato and into the Roman Empire, science, engineering, technology developed quite quickly. We started to have really big impacts on the world because of it. And the world started to become a little bit demythologized. God was filtered out, and human science and ingenuity started to take center stage. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the Western world got a little bit stuck into kind of religious absolutism, and the intellectual legacy of Greece was taken on by the Abbasid Caliphate and then into the Ottoman Empire. And then when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, luckily Europe was kind of on the rise, and the Renaissance and Enlightenment took all of the texts and knowledge that had been carried on from the classical period through the Abbasid Caliphate and the early Ottoman Empire back into Europe, and under the more open societies like Frederick the Great of Prussia, and then the rest of Europe, science started to pick up and start to displace religion again for a second time as the way that we understand the world. And people at this point were getting really into quantification and in seeing the world not necessarily as this interconnected biological system, not as something enchanted by God, but rather as something very mechanical. Technology was increasing rapidly. There was a movable type printing press. There was a lot of different technologies. And the analogy that people took on for nature was that it was created by God as engineer or God as clockmaker, that we could make machines that moved on their own and seemed alive, but weren't. And people like Descartes started to apply that to the way we saw the world and started to think of ecosystems as mechanical and able to be manipulated. And through ideas like Newtonian empiricism and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, we really thought that the world was something we could quantify and we could understand and we could control. And as industrialization picked up through the 1750s to 1950s, this was the world in which we inhabited. It was one that was knowable and where states were justified largely by the increase in the material standard of living that people had. In the 1960s, we had this recognition that this progress was not without costs. We understood that pollutants caused harm to populations of animals. They caused illness in people. And as we got through to the 1990s, we understood the limits to growth, sustainability became a topic, and the environmental movement was kind of modernizing and starting to push this idea of the need to rethink this really, really empirical structure on which our society is based that's got us into this problem of climate change. Then in 2008, with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and the Great Recession that followed, the Euro debt crisis, and now this new period of uncertainty brought about by COVID, there's an opportunity to re-examine the social contract, which is now being challenged again because quality of life is not necessarily on this seemingly unstoppable path to progress. And there's an opportunity now to present a narrative for change that isn't one in which we say we understand the world, we understand how it works, we can manipulate it, we can control it, and we can set a better future. We need to recognize that we know a lot, but there's a lot that we don't know. And in this context, when it comes to evaluating climate change, evaluating and putting a value on climate change impacts, there's through this history of empiricism and rationality, we can put numbers on climate change. But I gave this history quickly to make the point, to try and make the point that these numbers are just our best guess at what these costs might be. They represent price, not value, and they're one way of seeing the world. And since this whole worldview on which this kind of quantitative system is based has led to climate change, we ought to take it with a grain of salt in a way to say that this is one way that we can maybe get out of it. We can put financial pressures on the big emitters through different legal avenues to get them to pay for some of their costs. But we also, in trying to create a more just society and trying to do a more full cost accounting of these impacts, need to account for these more intangible, harder to quantify benefits. And so we'll get into both. We're going to start first with how we can quantify these, what some of the numbers are, and then how we might be able to do a better job of integrating these intangible values as well. So the problem with quantification, first, is that it's hard to do. It's a problem we can solve by collecting lots of data in this empirical tradition. So we can overcome that one. The second one is that price doesn't always represent the value lost. And sometimes it does for some things like infrastructure that can be moved or replaced. It's pretty straightforward. And so that type of replacement cost valuation is what I'm going to focus on here today. So that can be overcome. The third one, some people won't believe it for all kinds of different social and cultural and political reasons. I'm not going to get into that. I acknowledge that that's a big problem, but that is not something that can be dealt with in the 15 minutes I have left to talk. So replacement cost. This has been one of the main ways that we've been able to quantify the impacts of climate change. So in this first slide, I want to talk about how we've done this for things like dikes, railroads, agricultural, and non-agricultural real estate. So we have communities that have settled largely on coasts, and on coasts, largely in deltas and estuaries and floodplains where there's really high productivity land. People wanted to settle next to places where they could derive a lot of benefits. As a result, these are lowlands that are really vulnerable to flooding. So we've built dikes to protect us. As sea level rises, it increases by kind of a quantitative number. There's global sea level rise, which is called mean steric sea level rise. Then there's local sea level rise, which is the interaction of global sea levels, and then the uplift or subsidence of land in a particular place due to the Earth's kind of isostatic rebound from a glacier, or an estuary that kind of compacts itself. So the land moves and the water moves, and we end up with a number of relative sea level rise. And we can quantify this, we can predict it into the future, and we know that as the relative sea level rise increases, the height of the dikes will have to increase. Increasing the height of a dike will cost money. If there is, as there is in this case, a railroad on top of the dike, that'll cost even more money. We know how much we have to increase the dike due to a quantitative increase in sea level rise. We know how much this will cost, and this is our replacement cost. This is beyond the maintenance cost of a dike. This is going above and beyond what the dike costs. We need to pay more, and it's quite clear that these are attributable to climate change. This is something that we can fix. In the context of Metro Vancouver, the estimate for upgrading dikes is on the order of $10 billion. And so we've got a giant cost that our society has to pay because we've settled in lowland areas, and these lowland areas have been rendered more vulnerable due to climate change. We've got a lot of economic activity that's reliant on this protected area. This image here with this railroad has 27 trains a day bringing stuff up to our ports from the States. It gets shipped off around the world through the Port of Metro Vancouver, which brings in tens of billions of dollars in direct and indirect economic gain, employs tens of thousands of people. We have, right on the other side of the dike, agricultural land. This is corn here that feeds what's just off to the right of the picture, a bunch of cows that produce a lot of the milk that we get in the lower mainland. And of course, this land is owned by someone who doesn't want it to be flooded. And in the background, there are roads, there are houses, there are businesses that have property values and economic values and community values that we don't want to be eliminated by climate change. And in deciding whether or not we ought to replace this dike, we can weigh the costs of action, the cost of raising this dike and making it stronger, against the cost of doing nothing and losing all this other value. And so we can show that we have to do something. We can't just not do it because we'll lose this value, which is the real estate and the farms and the economic transportation connections. So since this is a really high number, let's take the lower one, which is fixing the dike. And so this is our kind of, we have to do it. We know how much it'll cost, and it's much easier to tie to climate change because we're building a dike to protect for a certain height of storm surge, which changes quantitatively with climate change. So this type of replacement cost is one way of calculating how much climate change will cost us. Another one is looking at coastal infrastructure, also in replacement cost. This is the waterfront area of the town of Gibsons on the left, panel A. This is mean high tide under 1 meter of sea level rise. On the right, it is mean high tide plus storm surge. And so in Gibsons here, if you can see my cursor, I'm just going along the shore, just under the blue is a nice little boardwalk where people can walk and enjoy the water. And under this boardwalk, there's a sewer line. And then I think over here, there's a pump station. And so as infrastructure ages, it needs to be maintained and needs to be replaced. So that's just a natural part of the infrastructure process. But what's happening with sea level rise in Gibsons, one, is that it's going to eventually permanently put this sewer and stormwater drainage system under the high tide, which means stormwater won't drain. And it means that the sewer line will erode and then potentially cause a bunch of problems that will make a touristy area less touristy if it breaks and creates non-tourist smells in the harbor. And so we can say, given that this is the sewer line and stormwater line is below the new high tide line, has a quantitative risk of erosion, we need to move it. There's a difference in the cost between just replacing and maintaining it as then to moving it, and this difference in price is a clear impact of climate change. A second, as you can see on the bottom here, panel 2, the high tide line, rather the storm surge line, is now flooding all kinds of, a couple of businesses, but all kinds of properties. There's this chronic flood damage to people's homes. So we can either, in this case, build a kind of a little mini dike walkway and look at the cost of that. or we can say, how much would it cost to buy back these properties and allow them to seasonally flood and just compensate the landowners and then move them somewhere else. Another issue that's related, that's in this example, but plays out bigger on a bigger scale on longer coastlines, is that at least in Canada, the boundary of your property is the natural boundary of the sea. And as seal, which is, is a physical defined area that a coastal surveyor can identify. And so if you have title to a property and it's, a rectangle, and the rectangle extends out to the shore when the property was created, as sea level rises, even if it doesn't erode your property, the natural boundary of the sea creeps up and eats away your square meters of property and takes off that value. It just deletes it from your landhold. And you now have your private land is converted to federal land as a natural boundary delineating a municipality and federal jurisdiction changes. So we have here, it's quite small, but you can imagine on long stretches of coast with a lot of coastal properties, people could lose 10% of their properties either to erosion or to a combination of erosion and a loss of land title. That can decrease property values because there's setbacks that show that you can't perhaps rebuild a house. If you need to have, say, a 10-meter setback from the natural boundary of the sea, and the sea comes up 5 meters, and you go, okay, well, I want to buy this property from someone, knock down the house and rebuild it. Now you go, well, you can't rebuild it in the footprint because this doesn't have a setback anymore. You can't build it too close to the road because the municipal zoning bylaws won't let you do it. And now this property value has decreased because climate change has changed the kind of political boundaries of our land. Another one is roads. Roads, of course, can be impacted by sea level rise, as we could imagine from this image. But roads also depreciate at set rates over time based on a combination of their use and the environment in which they are used. So if precipitation increases, if freeze-thaw cycles increase, the maintenance of roads, the maintenance schedule of roads compresses, and we end up having a lot higher costs for maintaining our roads. And a project that I'm working on with Andrew at West Coast Environmental Law, we're working at developing a system for quantifying this, and where we stand right now is we're looking at, over the next 80 years or so, about a $3 billion increase in road maintenance costs in BC due to increased wear and tear from climate change induced changes in weather. And another one here, let's getting out of infrastructure and getting more into starting to get close to the intangibles now, is the replacement cost of fisheries and wild foods. So this is a table from a report, a BC chapter that I led for the federal government on a coastal climate change assessment. And this particular table looks at the changing composition of the capture fishery in British Columbia from 1990 to 2011. So the capture fishery is not farms. This is changes in our total yields. This isn't fish population, this is just what we're taking. There's a lot of different influences on this. There can be different regulations, for example, and centralization of fleets and quotas that can change this as well. But our general trend, nonetheless, assuming that people want to catch fish and want to make money, we've had nonetheless an 82.5% decline in salmon real GDP captive fishery, and a 95% decline in herring. This has been this is a clear economic loss. The degree to which this can be attributed to climate change is much less certain than in terms of infrastructure. But what we do have is, in British Columbia, is a clear climate trend that is influencing this change. And so what you'll notice here in the middle is that tuna has increased by a lot. They're a very small proportion. It went from 0.2% of the fishery to 8.3% in terms of dollars, and they're up almost 3,500% in their value. This is because British Columbia is right on the border of an ecological transition zone between the Southern California current ecosystem and the Northern Alaskan current ecosystem. And as the climate warms, this transition zone moves north. And so what we end up with in Southern BC and the big Fraser salmon fishery is less less salmon as the water gets too warm for them to reproduce, the numbers decline, and we get more tuna from the southern ecosystem. So what we end up having is we're replacing salmon with tuna. And salmon, they're still going on up north, but they're very much at risk in the south of the province. And so what we have to contend with here is two things, well, three things really. One is, how can we quantify the degree of change in fish take from climate change, as opposed to policy that sets, quotas, markets that set prices, and fishers that may or may not catch too much. And the second is, if we could do this, to what degree can we offset it against the other benefits that climate change may bring, such as more tuna? So do we compare this? This is our first example in this talk of the conflation between value and price. Do we value, as people who live on the West Coast, our identity as a kind of salmon region, particularly for First Peoples and for people who have lived here for a long time? Salmon is a big part of this West Coast identity. It's not tuna. So what is this intangible cost? What is this intangible loss we have of the replacement in the south of the province of salmon with tuna? So if we can quantify a change in dollars, that's one thing. Tuna may very well offset our loss of salmon in terms of dollar for dollar, but we nonetheless incurred a loss, and quantifying that is much more complicated. And so that's what we get into here when we talk about biodiversity and habitat loss. I do a lot of work through Smart Shores on salmon habitat assessment and restoration, and we're working on different climate change projections that look at relative sea level rise and the salt tolerance of different types of vegetation, and we're projecting how this will change under conditions of climate change. So here's one example of an estuary. The purple is the estuary boundary, and the yellow is vegetation. That's great habitat for salmon smolts, for migratory birds, for shellfish, and is a really high biodiversity area, and it also serves as a high value carbon sink. So in 2019, let's call this time zero for sea level rise. We usually call time zero the year 2000, but for this example, let's just say this is today. Sea level is what it is. This is our distribution of vegetation. By 2050, under the RCP 8.5 scenario, this estuary should see about 12.5 centimeters of sea level rise, which will slightly change the distribution and amount of vegetation. By 2100, we go up to almost 0.5 meter. Again, slightly changed, a little bit reduced, but still not very much. But then, between 0.5 meter and 1 meter, there's this real critical window where the ecosystem kind of disappears. And so we could either push this out to, call it the scenario 2100B, which is our 0.5 meters of sea level rise plus about 65 centimeters from a partial collapse of the western Antarctic ice sheet, which may very well happen. But even if it doesn't happen, sea level will continue to rise well past the year 2100, and we'll end up in a scenario where we have this, a little over 1 meter sea level rise, and the estuary is pretty much toast. And so what's the value of this? We can think about it in terms of dollars, intangible losses to the First Nation that lives in just immediately adjacent to the estuary. But how can we quantify it? So for now, without getting into quantifying tangible versus intangible costs, the reason I was hired to do this work is because it's a project that's going to triage potential impacts and the possibility to restore estuarine habitat. And the costs of maintaining this biodiversity value will be restoration activities that will allow the coast to move inland, in this case, as sea level rises. So sea levels rise and they erode the coast, but this is a fine, normal, natural process. And the coast will replace itself as long as there's sediment in the system and has somewhere to go. But the problem is, as we've seen in these other slides, like this road, we have a situation where the coast just gets stuck against the road or against the dike and just disappears. This is called coastal squeeze, because the habitats are squeezed up along the coast and they can't move into here because this is a road, this is a blueberry farm, and we don't want to give up that land. So here, the cost of mitigating this is acquiring this property, which is a low-lying farm that was a dike is part of the estuary anyway, removing the dike and allowing it to fall back. So we've got land acquisition costs, and we've got the restoration costs of changing that activity. And that is a fixed cost of trying to adapt to this kind of biodiversity and habitat loss. And so one other thing about this quickly, then I'll move on and conclude so we can get to questions, is I wanted to frame this in terms of costs of remediation, not cost of impacts to First Peoples. And the reason is because I had started about 8 years ago a project in Southeast Alaska trying to quantify the costs of climate change on Native Alaskan subsistence permit holders. So I got data on changes to fish catch, on how much fish, how many different types of wild foods are harvested every year by Alaskan subsistence permit holders, and did a couple of economic exercises to take a small number, reduce it by population, per capita, so it's still really small, and then by indigenous population, and then by indigenous subsistence permit holder, and then relate this as a fraction of income. So we end up by saying, oh, it's going to cost, a couple $100 a person, to a few thousand to a couple grand per person, to per subsistence permit holder. And then when you look at it as a contribution to income, you can say, well, the ecosystem services of this local subsistence fishery is worth between 10 and 34% of the income of subsistence permit holders. And I thought, well, this is great. This is a great way of showing the livelihood impacts of climate change by relating this ecosystem service value to income. But the indigenous communities I spoke to about this were very upset and very angry with me for doing this and asked me to stop. And so I did. And the reason was because they had said that that's not what it's about. It's not just about that. And it's not about putting a number to it and then mentioning the intangibles like grandparents teaching their grandkids to fish. What it is about a way of life. And it is about maintaining a way of life, and to try to value that and put a number on it changes the focus from our rights as inhabitants of the land to a cost that can be mitigated. And instead of fishing halibut and salmon, we now just get some money and go buy the cheapest substitutable meat like pork chops from Super Save or something, and that's not the equivalent. And so to come back to the beginning of the talk, I gave this history of empiricism because that's the lens through which we see the world, and that's the lens through which we approach this kind of evaluation of climate impacts. But I think there's a time to step back from that and say, look, this is something that we just need to do because it's a human rights issue, it's a land rights issue. And the costs of mitigating this is, in this case, for example, acquiring the land and removing the dike so that the ecosystem can continue and so that these traditional land use rights can continue as well. And so how might we apply this to decision making? Really briefly here, this is something that's in the Ontario cost benefit analysis tool, their framework for climate change. There's nothing wrong with the framework. I like it very much, but I want to point out here with my big angry red arrows is in the data gathering phase and the developing inputs phase, we are stuck in this quantitative worldview. It's kind of this legacy of the Enlightenment, and that's great. That tells us a lot of really good things, but it is a very incomplete part of the picture. And I want to be sure that in presenting a talk on quantifying the cost of climate change, that we can do this to an extent. We can come up with lots of numbers. There are a lot of things we can't come up with numbers to as well, like the value of sites like this to the people who have used them traditionally, who use them today, and who want them to continue to exist in perpetuity. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk and share my living room with you. I will unshare my screen as soon as I can find the button.
Nathan, thank you so much. I'm so glad you brought into the conversation the question of quantification and its relationship to value and its relationship to price, not least which because as lawyers, I think sometimes we need to be reminded. I mean, the law only understands a particular language, including proving damages, for example, if we pursue one way, like if it's a tort claim as opposed to a human rights claim, and how there's like a path dependency that's really significant and can contribute to harm actually in ways that we might not appreciate. So that's really important. This was so exciting. Okay, I have questions, so I'm going to just start directing them, and I'm going to take them a little bit out of order because I feel like one of the questions, Sophie, you might help us with, because it's sort of a foundational question, which was, so in your view, what's the goal of climate litigation? So is it a money judgment? Is it, how will that help us? So what's the big picture theory behind climate litigation, and ultimately, what are you trying to achieve? Not you, Sophie, but I suppose all of us who care about these things.
So that this is kind of a lawyer's answer, but that will be really different in different contexts. So for public interest, or those who are trying to drive change. For example, I know the objective or the theory of change behind the carbon majors litigation is to push the US oil sector toward accepting that they need to change their business model and actually reduce their emissions. The aim is to change behavior by claiming damages, and to sort of hit them where it hurts in their hip pocket, so that they realize that it's a serious issue and executives take it seriously and decide to transition their businesses to net zero. That's the aim of some campaigners. Obviously I know that Sheer Edling spoke yesterday. They're a for-profit law firm. They're going to have different objectives. In different cases, public interest litigators might also have different strategic objectives. For example, you might take a strategic case in the public interest that you know that you're going to lose, but that might be helpful to make a point about the lack or a lacuna in legal protection for a certain on a certain issue. So it depends. I think though with the carbon majors, there's definitely the objective to drive them to change their behavior, or to force some kind of settlement similar to the tobacco industry settlements, ideally so that some of the profit that these companies have earned over all of the years can actually be spent on rectifying some of the damage that they've done.
Thank you. Okay, and then we have a question, I think who anyone could take it, I think, talking about the recent studies that conclude that methane emissions have been grossly underestimated, both in the United States, but elsewhere as well. So just wondering about whether there's any working theories on how to attribute the harms, or I suppose also to measure them, Nathan, where the gases may not have been accounted for. So we have a gap between what we're actually calling or accounting for and how to attribute or measure them. Do any changes in our monitoring regime come to mind that the scientific policy community could be advocating for to improve how we do it and to minimize that gap? I don't know if that's a Rachel or Nathan.
Sounds more of a quantification question to me.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with where that all. I know the studies that that are being referred to, but I'm not sure about how, where the science stands in terms of filling that gap. So I apologize. That's a bit outside of my realm of expertise.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question, just because it highlights for us that it's another piece of the puzzle that we're all trying to get all the pieces, and they all have to be put together to be successful either in or outside litigation. So that's just a really good way of highlighting the gap between, our working theories about attribution and measuring are only as good as our monitoring systems, I suppose, right? Okay, unless if Patrick asked that question, if he wants to ask a follow-up, let me know. I'll just move on to my colleague Brad Morris's question about the track record of success, if any of you know, in suing the major carbon producers for cross-border air, soil, and water pollution. So how receptive are domestic courts, I suppose, is the question, to accept scientific evidence derived from research in other countries? I don't know if Sophie might know most about that.
Could you repeat the question, Laura?
What's the track record of success in suing major carbon producers for cross-border air, soil, and water pollution? And how receptive are courts in country A to accepting scientific evidence derived from research in country B?
So the record of success in respect of climate change is nil at the moment. In terms of other environmental problems, I mean, to be honest, in Europe, which is, you know, where I'm based, and I have a lot more knowledge of the litigation here, it is still really hard for victims of environmental damage, especially when they're outside of European countries, to seek any redress from those companies headquartered in Europe. There were a series of claims by people from people living in the Niger Delta region who were victims of a lot of oil spills and, you know, contamination by Shell. And they are still fighting, and have been for over a decade, for any kind of compensation and damages in tort for those really direct harms in Nigeria. So it is still challenging. I think any kind of transnational litigation in respect of direct harm is very difficult. Stefan, I'm not saying that the record of climate change litigation entirely is nil, but those cases, I'd say those cases against states, I'm just talking about claims against carbon majors. So the big European claim at the moment that we're watching really closely is in the Netherlands against Shell, being brought by Friends of the Earth Netherlands. And that's probably the most similar to the North American tort cases being brought in Europe. However, they are not seeking damages, they're seeking an injunction, so injunctive relief to stop Shell from continuing to extract and sell fossil fuels, basically saying that it needs to wind down its production, pursue a policy of managed decline to align with the Paris Agreement. So that's a slightly different approach as well.
Thank you. So I have a question. It's for Nathan, parentheses, but also open to all. Thank you for making the risk of becoming preoccupied with quantification of loss in the financial terms so vivid, and for beginning to sketch some of the other kinds of loss being suffered. But could you say more about some of the creative ways in which intangible values are, or if they're not, might be built into efforts at quantification, sort of understood more broadly?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. That's really for a couple of reasons. One, it's something we need to talk about, and two, we need to talk about it because we don't really know what the answer to it is. That may not be the most fulfilling question, but I think, or answer, but I think it's still good to talk about, because there are strategies other than quantifying damages and trying to compensate people for them that we should maybe consider, such as giving people who would be more susceptible to loss more control over management of their own lands. For example, we have the Coastal Guardian Watchman program throughout coastal BC, where First Peoples are becoming more involved in the active management of lands and in their territories. And I think if we're unable to quantify these particular values, or rather price values or prices in a comparable way, where we can seek compensation, what we may be able to do, as just a suggestion, would be to allow greater autonomy over how resources are managed, so that in a scenario where they're declining, the people kind of at that point source of impact are able to make a greater contribution to management. So if we're losing fisheries take in a certain area, instead of looking at compensating people, we might look to people to say, okay, well, would you like to reduce quotas? Would you like to have a several-year moratorium? What would you like to do as a way of trying to mitigate. And the cost of climate change from that could be looked at in a different way, saying, okay, if we give management rights to a more local level, and there is a commercial fishery happening, for example, if climate change is putting this in under threat and it's going to damage a way of life that will affect these kind of higher order human rights and land rights, we say, okay, we have to maintain these rights as a higher order value. So we're giving this particular community the ability to say there's now a 3-year moratorium or a 5-year moratorium on fishing in this area. That will have an economic impact on the fishers, and that will be the economic consequence of climate change. Because if we can't allow these ways of life to disappear and we can't put a price on them, we say, okay, we need to just stop temporarily or reduce permanently to maintain it. That then incurs a cost, and then that may be a cost that that someone can seek compensation for. It's well beyond my wheelhouse to say whether that level of abstraction is something that someone could be held accountable for, but I think it's one of the ways we might try and at least put numbers to these otherwise intangible things.
Does anybody else want to say anything about that? I thought that's a really good idea, actually. Okay. Do we have, yeah, we have time, because this is picking up actually still on this quantification question, asking, so when we're thinking about the environmental costs of climate change, is there a role for ecosystem service style quantifications rather than just replacement costs? So specifically thinking about the hard to quantify areas like biodiversity loss, or however much percentage of an old growth forest coverage that's lost, where the services they provide might have a much higher inherent value than more traditional costs. And I'm not sure if that means like the service to the environment, like the fact that, like you said, the discussion about infinity, how can you measure infinity if there's no environment, there's no us, or something more narrower? Nathan, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think replacement cost is kind of the low-hanging fruit for this conversation, and I chose it because it's what things typically default to. It doesn't necessarily have to be at all. There's other different types of contingent valuation approaches that we can use for these intangibles. Again, replacement cost, even if you go outside of substitutable goods, we might look at things like how carbon sequestration or water filtration services postpone or stop the need to build a water filtration plant, or to reduce emissions, or to plant trees to sequester carbon in some other way, right? We can avoid a cost. Instead of incurring a cost to replace, we can avoid incurring a cost to compensate. So that's one way. Another way is looking at the values of the land, trying to quantify these intangible values by looking at, again, the price that is incurred in driving benefit from them. So for example, if there's an estuary that people like to visit to fish, how much did they pay for their fishing equipment? How much fish did they catch? How much gas did they spend? And how much mileage did they use driving there? How much did they pay for the ferry? Were there tourists flying up somewhere? So there's a lot of other ways to try and quantify this value, but it still keeps coming down to price. And while that's informative, it raises an issue of kind of a structural inequality in the way value is attributed, particularly in rural areas and particularly in Indigenous rural areas, because when price is the metric for value, willingness to pay is constrained by ability to pay. So a rich person from Georgia might fly up to Haida Gwaii and spend tons of money on a fishing trip, and that you go, oh, well, look at all the value of this recreational fishery. And as it was showed in that chart I showed of the fishery, the recreational fishery is increasing in value, and it's now one of the most valuable economically fisheries in British Columbia. But that at the same time takes away the value from someone just walking out, 10 minutes from their house, throwing a line in the water and pulling out a fish for virtually nothing. And so although there are a lot of different ways to quantify it, from replacement cost to avoiding replacement to these other types of contingent valuation approaches, there's a lot of structural inequalities built into the price focus, and that's fine as long as we acknowledge them. But I think, again, we need to have this kind of parallel value system that just goes, this is something we need to maintain, and maintaining it will sort out a cost. And we need to look, I think, at ways of bringing in that just we have to spend it because that's what our society is about kind of cost, rather than trying to quantify the price signals that lead to it. If that's hopefully that's a direct.
No, that's a great answer. And actually, when you were giving your slides, I was thinking to myself, wait, whose tuna is that? Like, is that tuna that used to be caught by people off the coast of San Diego or something, and now we're catching it, and so we're saying, oh, we've replaced our salmon with tuna, but what's happening to the folks who used to be catching that tuna? Is that right? Is that true, Nathan? Like that's someone else's fishery?
It could be. I mean, the tuna fishery is generally declining, and if it's just kind of that's just kind of Pareto efficient market problem, right? Where one person's tuna is someone else's lack of tuna. So unless we can, really generate ecological productivity the way we can generate GDP, we're not really having this kind of, ever, increasing this flywheel that keeps increasing value. We have a really finite resource, and unless we can really increase biodiversity, it really is one person's gain is another's loss, broadly speaking.
So it highlights the transnational aspects of this that are really hard to have conversations about, because as a Canadian problem, we have our tuna, but as a global problem, we have less tuna. Yeah. My colleague Karis wants to ask a question directly.
Thanks, Laura. I thought it would be probably easier on you for me to struggle through my own question. Yeah, thank you for these presentations. And I know we don't have much time left, so I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask this question. And really, it's just really expanding my imagination and my mind, sort of thinking about your presentations and how they all fit together. And I've had something that's been weighing on my mind since the Friday session, and I'm not sure if now is the right time in the flow of the overall discussion, but I've been thinking about this sort of Rachel's presentation, the global images, and Sophia, even the name of your client, the Earth, right? And how this really truly is a global problem that we're trying to somehow, as you said, Sophia, doesn't fit into the law properly. We're trying to identify a specific polluter and figure out how much do they owe us and for what harm. And it just strikes me, as much as I appreciate the importance of this exercise and the urgency, I worry about sort of global distributive problems in terms of who gets what piece of this pie for what type of harm. Is it more important to shore up the dike in Vancouver or deal with the typhoon victims in the Philippines? Who gets what in this sort of run for the money toward the companies? And, if you think about in bankruptcy law or debtor creditor, like somebody sits around and says, what is the order of priority based on law or justice? And I worry about sort of, a whole chunk of the population kind of getting left behind, as some folks have lawyers, some municipalities have lawyers, some governments have lawyers to pursue these companies who do owe, the planet something for sure. But I wonder about this sort of broader distributive justice kind of question. So just had to put that out there since I have an opportunity to speak.
And actually, I'm just going to build on that really quickly, because I was having sort of I didn't know how to articulate it. That's such a good question. But I was thinking more about sort of I raised the word path dependency, but I think about it as sort of jurisprudential costs. That is to say, if we pursue path A on behalf of B, we're not pursuing path F on behalf of G, because we don't actually have unlimited resources, either financially or human capacity or jurisprudentially. So I just wanted to know if that conversation is going on. Like, people in one country are thinking, hey, if you guys do this, and if you win this case in Holland or the Netherlands, it's great for certain countries, but it actually is going to be at the expense of our ability to claim this over here. That's our question.
So I take that one. So to answer Laura's question first, yes, those conversations are sort of happening. There is an international community of practice in the field of public interest climate change litigation, and people do try and speak to each other and align strategies as much as possible. Prioritization is always the most difficult thing, because obviously there are limited resources and a million problems and potential strategies. So prioritization is our biggest challenge. Definitely. And then, Charis, your question on, I think that sort of goes to your question as well. Like, you know, to what extent are some people missing out? It's imperfect, you know, and they are. And frankly, you know, I do wonder about the sort of, you know, value in that compensation going to New York and these cities in California, which are already like pretty rich cities on a global level. What's that funding going to be spent on if that money is genuinely extracted? I mean, you know, the system of toxic tort litigation is not perfect. And at the end of the day, you know, people say, well, lawyers are the ones that win a lot of the time. But I think that's why the climate movement, and particularly those in the States, and I'm not so close to the teams that are working on this, but I think that's why they really need to they need to situate their legal strategy in a political strategy, and they need to be ready to come at the moment when the fossil fuel sector is, you know, ready to negotiate with their proposal for a master settlement agreement, similarly to what happened with the tobacco industry. And that's when you go to Congress, I think, and you cut a deal, actually. That's what litigation does. It drives people to the table. And so I think the movement generally needs to be ready for if and when there is that breakthrough. And frankly, that breakthrough is probably going to come in the next 5 years. I mean, there are so many cases going on, and at some point, you know, I think they will have some success, and the industry is already really on its knees after COVID. And that's when I think you go to politicians and you drive through a regulatory change. Personally, I'm you know, saying that off the top of my head, I'm sure these strategies are all being worked out. But yeah, I think it's not perfect. There are issues of redistribution, and as you say, who is being represented. You know, only those communities that have access to lawyers and the time and bandwidth, quite frankly, to think through litigation strategies, which are expensive and slow and hard and cost a lot of money.
I'm going to jump in. I've been trying not to, as one of the hosts, sort of answer questions when we have these great panelists before us, but I would like to put in a plug that this question about that, you know, we've just had asked, I think goes really to the question of fair share, which is the topic of next week's webinar. So I would encourage people who want to discuss that a little further to join us next week. And if the question isn't directly addressed by the panelists, which I hope it will be, but I'd certainly encourage people to raise it again in the questions and discussions there. I'll just, as a preamble to how I might answer that question, I'll just say that I think litigation is one of the ways to ensure that these companies pay the share, and not necessarily in the long run the most effective. It is one that has particular traction and can help force some of the conversations we need to have as a society. But there are other ways that perhaps are fairer to, for example, looking at some of these issues in the international climate negotiations that may be fairer to the global population.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew knows a lot more about this than I do. So I'm just going to draw the webinar to a close, so we're on time. I want to thank you so much for joining, to all the folks who are on the Zoom with us. Also to my colleague hosts and panelists. I'm super grateful again to Andrew and Stefan, especially, and then to Nathan, Rachel, and Sophie. So everybody can join me in saying thank you to them, and hopefully we'll see you next week at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.